welcome to the official Lakes International Comic Art Festival podcast. My name's Ian.
And my name's Nikki, bringing you the best in comics and graphic novels and updates from the festival.
Hello and welcome to the Lakes International Comic Art Festival podcast, episode 53. My name's Ian.
What was that?
53.
53. Bingo!
My name's Ian.
And I'm Nikki.
Hello, we are on holiday mode.
We are on holiday mode.
We've spent the past week...
being everywhere, really.
Yeah, in the lakes.
Yeah, I'm knackered.
We visited more of the lakes
Yeah.
than we have ever,
Yes.
because your parents are up.
My mum and dad are
And
up.
your brother was up
And my
as well.
brother and my nephews are up.
So it kind of means we've not sort of read anything, done
No.
anything, got organised
No.
for anything.
We're getting up far too early on days off. That's what
Yes.
we've been doing.
I'll use my holiday to get up at 8 o'clock tonight.
And drive miles and miles and miles.
Yes, it's so good.
In the rain. Because it's still raining. I've had to put the heating on to dry clothes. It's raining all the time. It was the hottest day in the country down south yesterday. Hottest day of the year in the country.
In the country.
Ever.
In the outback.
But not here. What did it do yesterday, Ian? It rained.
It rained. Oh well. Such is life.
Yes.
So luckily we've got people we can rely on who actually give us content.
You are on holiday.
So on this episode we have got Simon Spurrier, amazing writer, done such works as 2000 AD, Sandman, which he talks a bit about, Labyrinth, which we reviewed and enjoyed reading. Yeah. But he also talks about reviewers, going to about reviews, and also just about the writing process as a whole.
He was amazing.
He's a really interesting guy.
We really hung on to his every word.
Yeah, so he's got a lot to say, real lot to say, and not just about his own work, just about the industry as a whole. So yeah, really interesting. He'll be at the Lakes in October.
Yes, and I will mug him.
What do you mean, mug him?
In a good way, in a good way.
How are you, mate?
In a good way.
Pete's talking about pitching. His pitching experience recently,
Yes.
which will be really interesting because it's something you'll be
Doing
looking
soon.
at doing down the line.
Yes.
Mike starts a 3-part series looking at the history of Dungeons and Dragons and comics.
Yes.
There's also an RPG style event happening at Lakes this year, so that sort of fits in perfectly with that.
It does.
And he didn't even plan it.
It's like he just knows.
It's amazing. And Tom reviews David Cooper's Panel a Day comic, The Price.
Brilliant.
So there's so much content without us.
No, you see, we're making ourselves redundant if we carry on
Yes,
like
that's
this.
true. We will have reviews and stuff next episode. But first I want to talk. We've been sent, there's a new fanzine. Well, it's not new. It's been a long running fanzine.
I was going to say, it's been out there for a long time.
AKA fanzine. It's hard to say.
Well, it's hard for you to say, dear.
It's the return of Scotland's longest running fanzine. The first issue, which is out very shortly, it's got content about Electric Soup, their 30th anniversary special, the real origins of Marvel.
It goes downhill then. They put him in it, haven't
The
they?
sensational
Matt Garvey.
What we should say is
Matt Garvey.
Jerry Holloway on Batman 89. There's a comic strip in there. And there's also a bit of a jokey bit about Mark Miller as well,
Yes.
which is quite funny. There's a lot of content for £3.
It's a very, very in-depth
If you're into
interviews
your
they do
comics,
and everything. And yeah, it's really brilliant.
If you're really into comics, there's so much content on interviewing, chatting to these people.
Yeah.
It's superb. So yeah, if you're a fan of comics,
Oh,
we'll
grab
put
it.
a link in. Go and have a look. £3. You get for that sort of magazine in W.H. Smith or something. You'd be paying £5 plus,
Exactly.
and you'd get just thousands of ads.
I was going to say it'd all be adverts.
Yeah, adverts. New perfume.
Maybe a little sachet then.
Yes, a little sachet. Yeah, you don't get any sachets of aftershave, I'm afraid. But other than that, it's great. So before we sort of leave the people who are important to do the work for this podcast,
Yes.
the new Batman has been.
Oh, yes. Yeah. Does he sparkle in the sunlight?
Why would he sparkle? And I'm saying that, and I've completely forgotten his name. What's his name again? It's Robert Pattinson.
Do you know, as you said that, all I had go through my mind.
Go on.
God.
It wasn't Danny DeVito.
No. What's Rowan Atkinson?
It may as well have been Danny DeVito.
Brilliant.
would he be brilliant? Hello.
Is that how you're doing
I'm going to take you down. That's my Mr. Bean.
I was thinking more Blackadder. That would be kind of cool if you did it in a Blackadder way. But anyway, yes, sorry.
Yeah, no, not Rowan Atkinson.
No.
Robert Pattinson, do you have any opinion on this?
No.
No. I personally think it's quite a good choice.
Yeah,
I think having a younger, I mean, he's not that young, but a younger person so he can do a series of films.
Maybe.
As the character.
It's down to the writing, isn't it, at the end of the day?
It is.
And it doesn't matter who they stick in it, really. If the writing's poor, then it's going to be awful.
Well, from what they've sort of said as well, it's not just going to be like focus on a villain, it's going to be multiple villains. So whether he's going to grab one, put it away or whatever. So it's going to take...
Just run down one out of here,
think about all of the superhero films generally follow a structure of hero stops one baddie, maybe two baddies.
Yeah.
It doesn't follow a world.
It should be then more like the original Batman movie where you had to like go against the whole group of them.
You're talking the Adam West.
Yeah.
No. Possibly something like Hush or The Long Halloween where
or the
you're
original
meeting
one.
multiple characters and they're involved in this world and the story as opposed to the single bad guy.
He has to shake a shark. He has to have shark repellent in his. If he hasn't got shark
repellent
them up,
in his belt, he just has to go
belt.
and deal with them.
I feel that you're trying to be far more serious than I am about this because it doesn't matter. We'll just see when the film comes out.
Having a good film matters. It doesn't matter who plays Batman as long as that person
That's what I mean.
Be that character.
Yeah, and like I say, it's down to the writing and down to breaking that Hollywood mould. Like
He's got a good jawline, as my daughter would say.
She says that about Tom Holland.
She does. Yeah. She does. Yeah. I don't like Tom Holland.
I think you're safe.
So I'm intrigued by what's coming.
Mm-hmm.
Really.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
We'll see. Something else which I'm intrigued by, not particularly comic related.
Is it something just sparkly on a ceiling? You're intrigued by that? You know, like a cat.
Are you trying to link that to the vampire thing again? No. Dark Crystal.
Yes.
A prequel from the film.
But you know it's all going to end bad. Yes, The Resistance, the something or other.
It looks good.
It looks amazing. The
really
puppets look great. They
I don't know
look
how
like the original puppets,
CG,
don't they?
CG as well in there, but yeah.
Well, there's going to be background CG, isn't there? But it looks like it's mainly puppet work.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm going to withhold judgment on that because I don't know how a series is going to work when we all know that it's the baddies win.
Well, look how good Star Wars was. Pretty cool.
Okay. Yeah.
No, but there is a lot of story.
Well, you got a whole world, haven't you?
How the Skeksis became evil, because from what I gather, they weren't. They used to all be harming us.
Well, there was one thing, weren't there?
Yeah.
They were split with the crystal. That's the whole thing. So you got I can't remember what they were called, the really, really good ones, and then you got Skeksis. But they were the turtles. But they were one being, because that's what happens at the end of Dark Crystal. They get put back to one being again, which is balanced. So you've got the imbalance of good and evil.
So yeah, I'm looking forward to it. We're going to just quickly, briefly...
Sorry.
Are you okay there?
I'm fine.
I hope people understand. I mean, it's kind of linked in there.
People of a certain age will understand.
Because Simon wrote Dark Crystal comic. So,
yes.
that's how it all fits together.
Yeah.
There's some more announcements for creators coming to the festival. Unfortunately for me, they are all Belgian, so I've got some names to read out.
Oh, good luck with this. Hang on, I need some popcorn to watch you try and pronounce some names.
Are you ready?
I'm girding my loins, dear.
Sergei Birkin. That's not so bad. Efferon. Loic Guam.
Wow.
Ben Giesemann. Valentine Lafitte. Don't put your hands over your head. Pascal Lamitri. Marianne Schneider. Judith Van Estral. And stop it. Joris or Van Mason. So they've already been announced. So the new names we're going to get is...
I mean, they won't recognise themselves from your pronunciations on there, really.
Pierre Van Hove, Benoit Peter, who obviously Lancaster University comics, deals with comics up there. Arthur Dupin, Fabien Toulemont, Alessandro Torta, and Nicholas Wilde. So
now you issue your apology.
To that. I apologise to all them. it's just growing, this list. It's brilliant of Belgian creators.
It's going to be really interesting.
And from what I gather, slightly different layout again this year as well.
Ooh.
I believe so.
Mixing it up a bit.
Mixing it up, make it. Yeah, we'll see. Be intrigued. So anyway, I apologise for all of those.
As you should.
For saying them all wrong.
Yes.
I'll put a link to the news article.
Yes.
So you can actually go and read them yourself and understand better than what I can say.
Yes.
So we're going to let you listen to some great interviews and chat coming up. Next episode, we have got with us, we've got Junko Mizuno.
Yes.
Really great chat with her.
It was very interesting.
It was. The language barrier was a bit of a challenge, but she did really well.
No, she's fantastic. Yeah.
So really interesting talk about her creativism and how she sort of had to fight almost to do what she wanted to do.
Yeah.
So no, really interesting. So that's coming up next episode, and we will have more reviews. We will have some reviews next episode. We will be organised for next episode, we won't be lazy.
We're not lazy. We've just been in the Lake District buying fudge.
Yes. Thank you for listening and enjoy the rest of the podcast.
I bought gooey fudge.
Gooey fudge. Everybody must buy
gooey fudge. Mike's Mutterings.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Mike's Mutterings. Today's ramblings will be part 1 of 3, where I'm shamelessly going to combine my 2 great loves and present to you the history of Dungeons & Dragons and comics. Comics for me have always been an escape, but it's a solitary pursuit, whereas Dungeons & Dragons is also an escape, but a social one where you share the fantasy with your friends. In the first part, I will go over the turbulent and inconsistent history of D&D comic publications, ranging from the early 80s all the way to 2010. In part 2, I will talk through the modern comic license, bringing us all the way up to today. And part 3, well, that's going to be the best of the rest. Those independent titles that were inspired by the world's greatest tabletop game from Gary E. Gygax. D&D is ingrained in the public psyche. Everyone knows of Dungeons & Dragons, even if they've never played it or seen it being played, and it's synonymous with geek culture. For me, there were 2 big explosions in the popularity of D&D. Firstly, around 83 to 86, when it was helped hugely by the children's cartoon and the Dragonlance novels that were published and became bestsellers. The next explosion was about 2014, with the release of the 5th edition rule set. And it's still riding that huge wave of popularity now, helped along by the phenomena of streamed live play, celebrity players, Stranger Things, and most crucially, the Critical Role web series, more of which I'll discuss in part 3. I actually started playing before high school even, and I remember that our small group of friends, we all thought that we'd found something unique, something underground and secretive. It felt kind of weird a year later when Dungeons & Dragons suddenly appeared as a cartoon on TV and exploded in the public consciousness. I remember having to explain that the cartoon was for kids really, and that our D&D was serious and adult. It was, after all, advanced Dungeons & Dragons, whilst all at the same time actually loving the show. And in between these 2 little bubbles of popularity, no one stopped playing. The role-playing market grew and grew, with games to satisfy every genre, niche taste and fantasy of anyone willing to play. I mean, what, few friends that don't play that I have? Wow, in the last couple of years, most of them have at least tried it, and I think they've realised that it's something that you can play at any age and at any level. Hosts Ian and Nikki have begun a game with their kids. And Pete's daughter Daisy quizzed me about the game, and I think she started playing in a group as well. And I've just got so many friends that have kind of been drawn inward to it lately. I mean, I currently run a few groups, and that includes a family and a friends of family game, and that consists of completely all grown-up couples. D&D and comics have been a huge part of my life, and throughout all of this, there's been this meeting of passions of Dungeons & Dragons comics. The real beginnings of D&D in strip form came in the form of adverts. Basically a single page of a story showing a group of characters who meet a monster and then drop a cliffhanger of what will happen next. You decide. And that was followed by a cut-out coupon to request a catalogue from the original makers of D&D, TSR. I remember these in the pages of US imported Marvel comics at the time, and they always stood out because they were a very different style of artwork, and it was just a bit strange when you compare it to the general superhero artwork that you're used to. These were just a series of adverts though, and after that there was absolutely nothing for 5 years. Even the fact that the D&D cartoon was on during that time, that never got translated into comics either. So it wasn't until 1987 that TSR released Dragonlance, which was a new world for players to explore and play in. It was created by Laura and Tracy Hickman and Margaret Weiss. This epic fantasy began with best-selling novels, Dragons of Autumn Twilight, Dragons of Winter Night, and Dragons of Spring Dawning. The Dragonlance setting is the world of Krynn, and this was as complex and as detailed as Tolkien's Middle-earth. They published D&D Adventures so you could play in this new and exciting world, and then finally they adapted the best-selling books at this time into comics. And to make that transition, they grabbed Roy Thomas, famed for being the comic writer behind the Conan the Barbarian comic series, and he scripted a superb adaptation. I loved the art, I loved the setting, but found it increasingly hard to actually find. The reason for this was because the comic never actually graced the shelves of a comic book store. Instead, they were sold in RPG shops right next to the game. The only other place I think I ever saw one was some huge bookstore in London I visited, because at this time bookshops didn't really have a graphic novels section, apart from a few asterisks. And that was a shame, because it was a rich setting and a best-selling story behind it, so any comic reader would have loved it. But luckily TSR wasn't blind to the benefits of having D&D comics sitting on the newsagent and comic shop shelves. It brings people into the game. It's a great advert for their product. So eventually they signed with DC in 1988 to start the D&D comics journey proper. And I always remember thinking DC was an odd choice to license then, because TSR themselves were licensed by Marvel to produce the official Marvel Superheroes role-playing game. At the time, TSR began creating new worlds for people to set their own games in, and publishing adventures and novels to support these. And they now wanted to do the same thing with the comics. First published was the core comic Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, which was set in the city of Waterdeep, part of the Forgotten Realms setting, which was the now default setting for Advanced Dungeons & Dragons 2nd edition. And I have to say, the series started quite nicely. There was a diverse party of adventurers. There was a female fighter, Vajra, a grumpy dwarf thief, Onyx, a paladin, Priam, I think his name was, the elf magic user, Cibriana, and I can't believe I'm saying this, there was Timoth Eyebright, who was a centaur. And it was the one thing I think that irked a lot of D&D players, because a centaur wasn't a playable race, and it was a little odd to include one in the party of adventurers, and I think a lot of people picked up on that. It was written by Michael Fleischer, and his credits included 2000 AD and Savage Sword of Conan, and so he had a pretty good CV behind him for this. It started pretty cool, and the back pages had background information and game statistics so you could actually play the adventures of the group that you'd just read. The art was by Jan Josima. I absolutely loved her stuff a lot later on. She did a lot of Star Wars stuff. But it was a quality choice, and her art was coloured brightly by Glenn Whitmore. As the saga goes on, Jan's art really improves. But unfortunately, the story begins to meander a little. In fact, really, it just verged on the silly side at times, and somewhere along the lines, they just lost the D&D feel for me. Luckily, it wasn't the only comic that they launched during this TSR DC venture. At the same time, they launched titles to support other D&D worlds. Dragonlance once again got its own series, and a brand new spacefaring fantasy setting called Spelljammer got its own run. And despite never having read any of the Spelljammer books or played any of the adventures, I absolutely loved that series. It was kind of spelljamming allowed adventurers to steer what are basically spaceships across different planes and realms of D&D. It gave for quite a nice, unique D&D experience, and I think I just loved the non-traditional setting and the cascade of ideas being thrown around. These comics were well read by non-D&Ders, but were treasured by the true Dungeons & Dragons fans, as you got to see classic game monsters and foes up close and personal, so you kind of forgave the occasional weak story because of that. But one setting was missing: Ravenloft. This is still one of my favourite D&D settings. Rather than classic fantasy, Ravenloft is a realm of gothic horror fantasy, controlled by the ancient and cursed vampire lord Strahd von Zarovich. Think old Hammer horror films, but done in a fantasy style. Ravenloft as a setting met my new, more mature needs for a grimmer tone to my games and more complex motives. The novels were bestsellers, and I awaited the graphic novels with bated breath. But they never actually came. In fact, everything just came to an end. TSR and DC had fallen out. Badly. They sold DC a license to produce comics, with gaming content in them, and then, behind their backs, produced their own gaming content with comics in. So TSR crossed the line not just with DC, but quite a few other licenses that they'd sold, and lawsuits began to fly in 1991. This resulted in the end of D&D comics for pretty much a decade. Between 92 and 2000, the only comics that appeared were once again in-house TSR-published one-shots whose sole purpose was to help advertise a product launch. I think there was only 5 or 6, and none of them particularly noteworthy. TSR, despite huge sales at the time, hit a cash crisis. The catalogue of financial errors and political backstabbing and just general mismanagement are all on record, and even the subject of a few books. The result was that in April 1997, TSR was bought out by the current guardians of the licence, Wizards of the Coast. Shortly after, the 3rd edition of D&D is released, this time returning to its original game setting, the world of Greyhawk. And this became the setting for a lease of life for D&D comics from publishers Kenzer and Company. In 2001-4, they released 4 Greyhawk titles: In the Shadows of Dragons, Tempest's Gate, Where Shadows Fall, and Black and White. I read a review of these in gaming magazines at the time, and they looked interesting, and they sounded like they began to play with different storytelling styles for D&D. Alas, I never saw them this side of the pond. They've never been reprinted or collected either, so forever just remain a mystery to me. And the same goes with the 2002 Vecna Hand of the Revenant comic from Iron Hammer Graphics, and the 2004 Free Comic Book Day comic called Crisis in Ramerton. Though I think that's a bit of a collector's item now, to be honest. The game itself went to 3.5 edition, and there was another lull. It wasn't until 2004 that the next age of D&D comics began, with Devil's Due Publishing. They had a very specific remit, though. They were doing straight adaptations of the hugely popular D&D novels and short stories. So, first up, they started with the big hitters. They did a long adaptation of R.A. Salvatore's Legend of Drizzt books, and that included Homeland, Exile, Sojourn, Crystal Shard, Streams of Silver, The Halfling's Gem, and The Legacy. Drizzt is a drow or a dark elf, and very much an anti-hero, and his adventures across the Forgotten Realms range from the trivial to the epic. These are very well-written works of fantasy, and the comics really did do justice to them as well. There was a host of top-notch artists brought, brought in, and the morally ambiguous heroes just brought to life on the page. There was the new adaptation of the New York bestselling Dragonlance Chronicles, and this was just so superior to the TSR attempt of adapting it back in the 80s. Regardless of whether you have read or played D&D, if you like fantasy, then these two series of books are seriously recommended as classic fantasy works. More Dragonlance novels were also serialised after such a great reception. They also did The Worlds of Dungeons & Dragons, and this is where they adapted all those short stories from the odd book here and there, or the many gaming magazines that supported role-playing. The settings were wide and varied, and finally included my beloved Ravenloft. But this era of quality adaptations ended in 2008, but thankfully these are not lost to the flows of time. They've all been collected and reprinted by the publisher of the next great age of Dungeons & Dragons comics, IDW. Next episode will be all about IDW and how they delighted D&D fans. They took more risks and modernised the telling of D&D stories. And that will bring us all the way up to the modern day. So, till next time, brave adventurers, goodbye.
How are we doing, guys?
Good. Thank you for coming on, Simon.
Absolute pleasure. I really appreciate you finding the time to do this. I'm sorry.
No.
Oh, it's fine.
You're the busy one.
Well, busy in inverted commas. It's half work. I say half. It's more like a quarter work and 3/4 dealing with baby puke and disgusting emanations from other directions.
We've both been there.
Yeah, good. Right.
Anne's got through it.
Yeah. Wave that ship off into the distance.
Yeah, they don't get easier when they get to teenagers, to be fair.
Yeah, well, this is, everywhere we go now and there's parents, we sort of, does it get any easier? And you can see people trying to calculate whether they should be kind or honest. you can tell the honest ones. No, not really.
Yeah, we had Hannah Berry on a few weeks back, and she left crying after the interview.
Really?
Oh yeah, we told her some other things.
We told her live facts.
Yeah.
Before we start, can I just get the pronunciation of your surname correct? Is it Spurrier?
I say Spurrier, but that's because I'm a posh southern freak. But yeah, whatever works for you. Spurrier, Spurrier, whatever. It's all the same to me. But Spurrier is how I say it.
It's hard when you've got a surname that people just can't. Mine's the same. Everyone spells my name wrong. It's ridiculous.
They do.
And it gets on my nerves.
I mean, most people assume my name is some wonderful French thing, Spurrier. It's a guy who makes spurs. It's that boring. A person who makes spurs is a Spurrier. There you are.
There we go.
There you are.
There we go. Right, we're going to dive straight in. We'll do the introduction on the other side of the podcast when you're not around. So we'll get straight into some questions, shall we?
Do it.
So tell us a bit about yourself growing up. What sort of comics were you into? If you were, that is.
I came to comics quite late, I suppose.
Okay.
I think I never really, because I mean, I'm telling you nothing you don't already know, but in the UK, if you're a very young child reading comics, you're probably reading the sort of Beanos and Dandies and that sort of stuff. Mm-hmm. And that all passed me by totally, never really got into that sort of thing. I think I remember being quite big on Asterix when I was at school. Mm-hmm. School libraries often have that sort of sad little corner full of Asterix and Tintin.
I think that was about it, wasn't it? Oh, that's all they ever had.
Or Fungus the Bogeyman.
You know what? Nobody else bothered with that except me, and I think that probably was quite transformative because I never really imagined that they constituted comics. You don't, do you? You just think that's these funny things that you can read and they have wonderful pictures, and Asterix in particular. I mean, I've spent my whole life doing dreadful puns, and I suspect there's probably some source material in there because those translations from entirely different French word plays are just extraordinary. But yeah, I think I sort of didn't really touch another comic until I was about 16, and that was around when weirdly enough, I remembered this the other day. There's this weird James Herbert. You remember he did a whole bunch of quite sort of naff horror movies about rats. The rat's this and the rat's that.
I love the rats.
He did this.
Were they ever made into movies?
I don't know. Not that I've ever
just
seen.
Novels,
but the last episode in that Rats cycle sounds awful, but the Rats cycle, that's a thing you could ride to work every morning, isn't it? But they created this graphic novel, and I forget the name of the artist, but it's just this really weird slice of sort of gothic post-apocalyptic horror. Doesn't really work as a comic now I go back and read it, but that was what made me realize that you could do storytelling that combined words and images, and the images were the thing that really hooked me there. And that drove me off into 2000 AD and Judge Dredd and the kind of big thrusting muscular nonsense of Simon Bisley and the Judge Dredd Batman crossovers and that sort of stuff. And I think somewhere along the way I started getting 2000 AD and realized that there were a lot of strips in there that I adored, but also a lot of strips that in my teenage arrogance, I felt I could probably do better. And I'm not saying I ever could, because teenagers really are arrogant and awful, but it inspired me to sit down and start sending in submissions to the Future Shocks slot, which 2000 AD has, which is sort of, to this day, as far as I know, the only official, formulaic and formalized outlet for wannabe writers, certainly in the UK.
Yeah, it does. It gives people that chance to really have a go, and it's great, to be fair. And I love Future Stock, so they're brilliant.
It's such a difficult thing to get right, and that's exactly why I think that is the kind of the gatekeeper to writing for 2000 AD, is if you can tell a satisfying story with a twist in the tail in however many pages they are allowing at the moment. I think it's probably 4 right now, but it was 5 when I started. Then you can do anything. And in fact, a lot of the advice I read online when I was trying to get work for 2000 AD said things like, find your favorite issue of an American 22-page US format comic and rewrite it as a 5-page or 6-page issue. And you know what? It's a lot easier than you would think. And if you can do an issue or an episode of something for 2000 AD, then everything else is kind of easy by comparison.
Yeah. I'd like to say I'll give it a go, but I don't think I could manage that.
It's not, yeah. Well, the other, I mean, I sit here saying it's easier than you think. Now that most of my work is in 22-page or 20-page format, you sort of get a bit lazy.
Yeah.
You let your belt out a little bit. These days, if I go back and do bits and bobs for 2000 AD, it's a lot harder than it ever was before.
So, did you have any education in writing as such, or did you just sort of jump straight into it?
Just jumped in, really. I always saw myself, from quite an early age, I wanted to write stories, but certainly comics didn't really appear on my radar anytime soon. I was always the kid in class who would choose to do the kind of creative writing homework instead of the essay. Mm-hmm. I remember, writing all sorts of very generic short stories with aliens and monsters and time travel, and lots of despairing teachers who were kind of diligently marking my grammar and punctuation while reading this DOS that they actually and then I guess around the same time, I can't remember the order that these things happened, around the same time that I started getting into comics, I was pitching short stories, prose stories to Games Workshop did a series of magazines. There was one called, I think it was just called Warhammer Monthly, and one called Inferno, that ran prose short stories based in their various games universes. And I was never really big on playing war games. I'm still not really, but I loved the amount of detail and care and consideration they had put into building these shared worlds. And eventually I got a couple of short stories published through them, and at around the time that I was starting to do more than just Future Shocks for 2000 AD, I started getting offers to do novels for them. So these two pathways kind of took off at the same time, and that's sort of been a recurring thing in my life. I never really know what sort of writer I am or I'm supposed to be. I've done novels, I've done lots of comics, I've done TV, I've written a bunch of screenplays, and they all give me very different gratifications, and they don't really feel like the same job at all. I always say it's the difference between being a mechanic and being a racing car driver. You know, they both abstractly revolve around engines, but they couldn't be more different in terms of the day-to-day. So I'm just a bit of a contrarian. If I've got more work than I can handle in one medium, then I'm sitting here itching to do something in the other medium. So, it was always the intention was always that I would be a novelist. And then I kind of got ambushed along the way by comics, and I've enjoyed every minute of it. But my God, the desire to get back to novels at some point when life is a little less crazy is very strong.
Okay, I was going to ask you about the Warhammer stuff actually, because I'm a fan. I'm a geek, and I know obviously that the world is huge. How especially as someone who's not into it as much as say I would be, how do you get into that universe to be able to write a novel about it? Because there's so much background.
Sort of already was, and that's the beauty of those gaming worlds, is that you really don't have to be into the war game in order to be a major fan of the what we dismissively called the fluff, which I think is now not a word that one uses in polite company. But I would go and buy all the codexes and the rule books and stuff without really any intention of playing the games. I played a few of them and enjoyed it enough. I like painting the figures. That was always far more interesting to me.
You can paint mine now, please.
But yeah, it would sort of... I would just spend hours. I still do, you know. I haven't got any space in this house for figures, and I don't really have any time in my life for wargaming, which I regret greatly because I know it's picking up steam these days, and I kind of very jealous of all my 30, 40-something friends who were able to go and get together and do wargaming and do role-playing and all those things that I just never really have time to do now. But I still spend many a delighted, wasteful hour on the Games Workshop website, scrolling through all the new figures, saying, "Oh, that's nice. Oh, I wonder how I paint that," and not doing anything of the sort. So they're very addictive, these shared worlds.
I'm getting some funny looks here, like, that's you. That's you.
That is literally Ian.
Can't help it. Once a nerd, always a nerd. That's the way I look at it.
It's like crack. I mean, at the risk of getting a little bit wanky about it, it's always been my contention that shared worlds, especially shared worlds that rely upon any sort of genre conventions, have a sort of occasionally destructive, actually, gravitation towards detail. And I would put it in the same way that our universe, very, very slowly, on a long enough timeline, errs towards entropy. You know, that's the state at which the amount of information in a system becomes so complicated that the system itself ceases to have any use. It's essentially things break down. The center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. All that sort of stuff. In genre fiction, the longer a shared universe exists, the more layers of detail and explication and this takes the form of things like maps in the front of your fantasy books and knowing what your central character ate for breakfast and encyclopedias and illustrated guides and all this stuff. And as consumers, we lap it up because we are desperately in love with these worlds. We yearn for detail. We want to feel like we can position ourselves inside these worlds because we've loved the fictions that we've experienced, which are based in these worlds. But from a storytelling perspective, it's poison. Because the more detail exists on a fictional world, the harder it becomes to do new, interesting, and valuable things inside that world. Which is why I suspect different shared universes take various different tactical approaches to dealing with this problem. You know, as you know, the Games Workshop worlds frequently, well, not frequently, that's not true, but recently went through some fairly major upheavals and have sort of reinvented themselves. Yeah. The Star Wars universe took a far more scorched earth approach and just said, well, all these years of expanded continuity, we're just going to ignore it now, and we're going to say that it's legends instead of reality, and we'll reboot and start with a whole new continuity. And those are brilliant approaches to continuously allowing this natural process of detail being accumulated constantly without it becoming too heavy and too onerous to the storytellers to work around it.
But is that not a bit of a risky move to take? I mean, you can really upset the fans. Let's be honest. That's
God, you really can, and I'm sure there are examples where it's gone horribly wrong.
Yeah.
But I can't think of them, and I do wonder. I suspect that fans, in fact, all consumers of all fiction, are far more sophisticated in what they are prepared to put up with than we tend to think. The example I would give is a fan who loves Batman, and they read all the books that have Batman in them. Now, they know rationally that there is no way on Earth that Batman can be running around doing 3 different mysteries in Gotham and a part of 4 different teams fighting off Martians, and there's just no time in the world for him to do all of these things at once. But the fan of Batman does not let that stop them from enjoying the stories. And the human mind is very good, especially when it comes to fiction, at permitting that which it wants and ignoring that which would seem to derail the things it wants. People will moan about it online. Oh, that doesn't seem to be able to fit with the continuity, but they'll still read it and probably still love it. And I have this exceedingly pretentious adage, which annoyingly is right. It's always right. And it's Spurrier's first law, and it's that factions speak louder than herds. Yeah. And by that, what I mean is that if you are shouting about something as loud as you possibly can, you're probably the only person who thinks it. And so when people jump up and down on the internet going, oh, this seems to break continuity, and how dare they reset this universe? It's probably 1 out of 1,000 people, and everybody else is quietly, without any demonstration, just enjoying the new stuff. So, yeah, it's tough, and that will appear like a slightly dismissive view of having some engagement with the fandom. But I do think that, to give you an example, I write a Star Wars comic, Dr. Aphra, and it is impossible, obviously, not to occasionally check reviews. He says, pretending that occasionally doesn't mean literally every day. But, the people who excoriate everything I write do it month after month after month after month because they're still reading the comic. And that's the weird dichotomy that lies at the heart of writing in these shared fictions. People are addicted to them, and they love them. They love them enough that when something doesn't quite work, they'll shout about it. But it doesn't mean they don't love it, and it doesn't mean they won't keep enjoying being able to shout about it. It's almost perverse, but it's also quite wonderful.
It's quite interesting, actually, reviews. It's a hard topic to look at. I mean, we personally only review in a positive light. If we don't like something, we won't discuss it because there's just no
really
point.
Enlightened.
Yeah, it doesn't make sense. Why talk about negative things? Why do that? Do you feel that there's a big difference? And I personally think there is, that when you're doing stories like for Star Wars, for Marvel, the reviews are so much different to the small press reviews because they tend to be more of the positive side. Have you found that changed as you've progressed, or?
Yeah, I mean, yeah. Endless books could be written on the psychology of reviews, and I wind myself up about how much I care about reviews, and there is this sort of battle cry amongst all creators behind the scenes: don't check the reviews, never read the comments, don't check the reviews. But we all do, because we're human, and we wouldn't be working as storytellers, and I say that term to cover both writers and artists because we are all storytellers. We wouldn't be working in that form if we didn't care deeply and or need desperately to know that our audience is hearing what we say, seeing what we draw, and feeling things about it. So it's fairly natural that we want to know what is being said about our work. So yes, we all read reviews. Is there a different metric by which the kind of shared universe stuff, the big two, the major brand things are gauged compared to indie books? Yes, I think there probably is. And I think, and I'm making this up as I go, honestly, because I try not to spend too much time agonizing over these things, because it can kill you as a storyteller. You can really damage yourself if you care too much about this stuff. But I think brand is probably the critical word in there. I feel as though if you're reviewing a big two book, then part of what you are doing is comparing this artifact, this story, this text to some bigger standard by which the brand can be judged, and which has probably evolved over many, many years. And so you have this thing to compare it against, which is why so many reviews, especially the lazy ones, they won't be about how good the story is, how valuable the story is, how much meaning it has in it. They'll be about how the story compares to what the reviewer thinks a good Batman story is or a good Spider-Man story is. And Spider-Man wouldn't talk like that, and Superman probably wouldn't do that. This is ridiculous. Whereas an awful lot of indie stories, which don't necessarily have the background, the baggage, will be judged on far more objective terms. And I guess, again, I'm making this up as I go. I'm aware that it sounds like I'm saying that it is better to be reviewing an indie book than it is to be reviewing a big two book. And that's not the case at all, because you don't write or draw a Spider-Man story without the tacit knowledge that it is being slotted into a far grander continuum. So these are all things that you have to bear in mind. You have to be prepared to pass once you've created a story in one of these universes. But I would be lying if I didn't say that writing indie comics, creating things from scratch, feels to me far more creatively rewarding, because I know that everything inside that world is generated from me, and I can accept the judgment of reviewers as being far less coloured by things that weren't under my control.
Well, we reviewed Labyrinth Coronation just last episode, I think it was, which we say we definitely enjoyed that story.
Thank you.
How was it writing that? I'm assuming, I might be wrong here, that you were given complete freedom to create that story, or not, because obviously it's complete fresh.
Yeah, I mean, complete freedom in inverted commas.
I mean, it's got to lead up to the end result, obviously, but
it's yes. It was a bit of a complicated process with Labyrinth, and it always is with an IP that has so much hanging on it. There aren't many intellectual properties where an editor can come to me and say, here is a thing, we want you to write a story set in this world, better yet a sequel, would you do it? There aren't many of those things that I have to say yes to. There aren't many things that I care that much about that I wouldn't rather be doing something of my own. Dark Crystal was one of them, and Labyrinth is another one. And the arseholes, the wonderful arseholes at Boom knew that very well, because I had spent plenty of time getting drunk with them, talking about how much I loved Vince and stuff. So when the opportunity arose, they came to me without pause, and they knew I'd say yes, as manipulative freaks. What happened in practice? So the Dark Crystal one, to jump back a few steps, the Dark Crystal one was sort of the gateway to doing the Labyrinth one. It eventually transpired. And the Dark Crystal one came with far more strings attached, because it was very loosely based on a screenplay that had been circulating round and round Hollywood for decades. A sort of sequel to the movie. And although we changed everything, the kind of core conceits in the story we told in the Dark Crystal world were already there in the screenplay. So we knew when we signed up for it that we were going to be doing lots of backwardsing and forwardsing with the people at the Henson Company, and the Boom guys got very good at playing the role of the interlocutor between the kind of it would be cruel to say corporate, because they're really not like that at all, but in terms of the structure of this creative process, the Henson people are sort of the big corporate client, and the artist and I would be the sort of front-facing people putting it all into application and execution. And we figured out quite quickly that we could handle this hierarchical creative process quite successfully. So when Labyrinth came along, and for years and years, it transpires Boom has been pitching Henson the idea of some sort of Labyrinth spin-off or sequel or prequel. And they sensed that the door was cracking open ever so slightly, and they asked me to come up with, what would you do if you were given the chance to do a Labyrinth sequel or prequel or any sort of spin-off at all? How would you tell that story? And I pitched that. And they said that for the first time, Henson came back actually expressing interest and said, well, this is a thing we haven't considered, so we might actually be up for this. So yes, when that sort of all happened, I wasn't too worried about the creative back and forth, about having this corporate overlord staring over my shoulder and telling me that you can't do that, and the goblin wouldn't say that, and all the things that can be really dangerous about getting into an IP exploiting storytelling situation, because we had established this working process already, and the Boom guys are great at shielding the creators from the more annoying end of that inevitable back and forth. And I imagine they're also very good at interpreting my pissy creative tantrums to the bosses at the top, so they don't sound like I'm having a little screaming habdab every time I can't do exactly what I want. So in practice, it worked very well. The slight complication with the Labyrinth thing was that halfway through it, my wife had a baby, and all sorts of other things started happening in my world. So because we had established a very good working practice with the Dark Crystal comic, we did the same thing with Labyrinth, whereby I plotted the last 6 issues extremely tightly, down to the level of saying, on this page, the following things happen, on this page, the following things happen, and then handed over the scripting duties to a very talented writer called Ryan Ferrier, and then it would come back to me and I would do a polish. And in practice, I didn't even do a polish on the last couple of issues because Ryan had sort of taken and made it his own. The voices, I don't think it's perceptible that the voices change, but to me, as the person who was writing the voices in the first instance, it felt wrong to be going in and fiddling with all his voices constantly. So the last couple of issues, my only involvement really was that I plotted them way back when, and everything that you see on the page is down to Ryan. But it's still a wonderful, proud feeling to be able to look through all 12 issues. And that's the heart of comics. It's collaborative. You don't get into comics if you are somebody who's precious about everything being generated by yourself. And to go back to what I was saying before about the distinction between novels and comics, you don't get to write and enjoy writing comics if you are only ever wanting to be a novelist, because you are too precious, you're too megalomaniacal, frankly. You want everything that appears on the page to have emerged from your own creative genius, and that will kill you as soon as you try and do that in comics, because you have to devolve your responsibilities and you have to share your end results with a legion of other talents who will, under the best circumstances, make something better than the sum of its parts.
It's quite interesting you're saying that. Nikki's past year or so started creating comics, and she's shaking her head saying, yes.
It's tough. Me. It's a really hard thing to learn. And I mean, for instance, this week they just announced all the nominations for the Eisner Awards. And my artist on Coda, which is a thing of which I am proudest in the world, I think it's some of the best stuff I've ever done, he got a nomination for Best Artist, and that's brilliant. It's such a great feeling. It's not my work that's being recognized, it's his work, and that means as much to me as if they nominated me for the same thing, because he and I can only share this symbiotic creative process on a book, especially a book like Coda. Question to myself, would it be different if it was a work for hire shared universe? Probably. Don't know. Haven't thought about that. But in as much as Coda is our baby, it's like somebody coming up to my wife and saying, that's a beautiful child. I don't care that they're not saying it to me. They're saying it to my wife, and the child is still beautiful. So it's a wonderful disengagement of one's preciousness to be able to just sort of relax into a collaboration.
Okay. Yeah. And you have been Eisner nominated yourself, obviously.
Yes, we got one for The Spire a couple of years ago, which was also hugely wonderful. I mean, my books with Boom, they're characterized by insane levels of world building, great freedom on my part to tell the stories I want to tell in worlds that I've generated. But the way it's turned out is that in every case, the beauty of the project has been just saying, here's an artist that has stepped up and done something astonishing. Let's just let them have fun with it. And in Coda, I mean, God, I'm super proud of my story. I think it has value. I think it has meaning. But the joy is just going, here's a page that Matthias is going to absolutely slaughter, and turning it over to him and sitting back and going, hey, this is easy. My inbox is the most exciting place in the world when he starts sending pages through. So it is. It took me a long time to learn this. And it took me a long time coming from the tradition of writing prose and to an extent writing teleplays and movies wherein you really don't expect to have to deal with anything after the point you've typed the words "the end." Coming from those traditions, it took me a very long time to stop seeing the stuff that the artist was drawing wrong, to stop saying, well, that's not how I would have done it, therefore it's bad, and start saying, well, that's not how I would have done it, and therefore, holy shit, it's amazing. Look at this. I couldn't have done that. I would never have thought of that. And as soon as you can make that little mental leap, comics becomes a really joyous experience.
Brilliant. Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah. we're so engaged listening to this. Absolutely loving it. So what plans have you got then for the future? Obviously, you say you got Coda. Is that continuing or?
No, Coda will end with 12, and that was all written a little while ago. So I'm, in fact, exactly what I've just said. Every day I get a new page from Matthias, and it's mind-blowing. So that'll finish. I can't remember when issue 12 comes out, but that'll all wrap up within the next few months. Matthias and I have got some other plans. We're cooking up for the future, doing Dr. Aphra for Star Wars. That continues for at least a little while longer. And then some big secret stuff going on there that I can't really talk about. Doing The Dreaming for DC, Vertigo. So that's... what happened was they approached Neil Gaiman, writer of the Sandman books, and essentially said to him, well, do you feel like there's still any stories to be told in these various realms that you created? Because when you go back and read the original canon of Sandman material, you realize that an awful lot of the best-known comics in that sort of slightly dark, mature corner of DC arose, or at least were serviced by Neil in his storytelling revolving around the Sandman. And I mean, obviously the Sandman himself and the Dreaming and the Endless, but also things like Lucifer and the books of magic, and to an extent the kind of tradition of Alan Moore's Swamp Thingy, Hellblazer-y stuff. There's this sort of loose coalition of story properties which, excuse me, which nebulously fall under the term the Sandman universe. And that was what Neil got quite excited about. He said, yeah, definitely. You know, he's said what he has to say about Sandman, but he felt like he could enjoy curating a series of new books which in some way exist within that universe, that shared reality. And I was delighted and very humbled to be picked by him to helm one of those books called The Dreaming, which is, I flatter myself, but it's arguably the closest to being a sort of successor to the Sandman cycle, in as much as it is set in the almost indescribable reality where the Sandman is in charge. And certainly for the first couple of arcs of our tale revolves around the disappearance of the latest dream of the Endless and what we're going to do about the fact that he's not here anymore and what happens while we try and look for him and so on. So that's a really big project in my slate at the moment, and it's being drawn by the absolutely astonishing Bilquis Everly, who I'm a little bit secretly gutted did not get an Eisner nomination this week, because she really, really deserves it. It's mind-blowing stuff. But that will continue for the foreseeable future. And that's, I think that's some of my best work. It's just a wonderful realm in which one can tell sort of any story one wants. If I feel like doing a Western this week, then I can do a Western. If I feel like doing some superhero stuff, then we could probably plug that in somehow. Sorry. I'm just going to take a tonk on some coffee here. Seriously, coffee is my lifeblood.
We all need it. We definitely need it.
So there's that. There's a new creator-owned book I'm doing through Boom, which will be announced, I think, at New York in October. And then 2 really, really big new things, which must remain secret for now. But actually, to jump forward a little bit, this is what's kind of lovely about the Lakes Festival, is that I know by the time I arrive, I will have announced a couple of quite significant projects, which I can really enjoy talking about, because I'm having to bite my lips a lot at the moment. So
we're going to go on to that. You're going to come into the Lakes this October.
Yay.
That's right.
Sunny Kendall.
It's really
I love it. There's going to be the second time this year I'm up in the Lakes.
Okay.
So greatly looking forward to it.
What time of year are you coming for the first time?
In June.
That's better.
It'll be a little bit nicer, I imagine.
It'll be warm rain.
A group of geeks, many of them from the comic sphere. There's about 14 or 15 of us, and every year we go away for a week, not even a week, 4 or 5 days in the summer, to occupy some big ancient mansion somewhere to get dressed up in silly clothes and do murder mysteries and play board games.
Oh, brilliant.
So it's great fun, and lots of silly pictures emerge. This is the first time we're going to try it with the baby in tow. So that's going to be, that's up in the lakes somewhere.
I'm sure you can dress the baby up in some gear as well.
Right? It's funny. I mean, one of the first things that happened when the kid arrived was we're immediately researching cosplay options. Whole new world of opportunities.
Where else are you going this year? Have you got any other events planned as well?
So off to New York in early October. So there's a very good chance I will be literally ruined when I come second weekend. I think that's it, actually. There was a sort of, will I or won't I come to San Diego this year? And I've decided not to, just because it's such an expensive and energy-draining experience. So the baby is sort of taken priority. Apparently, that's a thing parents are expected to do.
Unfortunately, it's...
Nobody told me that this was going to be part of the contract, but apparently I have to be selfless for a little while. So it'll be New York, then the Lakes, and then I think we go to Thought Bubble because that's later this year, isn't it?
It's a month after, yeah.
So those are the only ones, as far as I know, which is quite a lovely thing.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for your time this morning.
Oh, genuine pleasure.
And you make so you get a few more coffees down that throat to survive the rest of the day.
Isn't it? Because now I'm so caffeinated that if the little sod does actually go for a nap, there's no way I can go for a sleep. I'm just going to lie there vibrating. So I might as well do some work.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you so much.
Pleasure, guys.
Howdy, welcome to Breakdowns, the comic art section of the podcast. I'm Pete Taylor. I'm a small press comics creator and illustrator. Online I trade as This Man, This Pete. This episode I'm chatting about pitching. I recently sent in a proposal to a couple of comic publishers and found the exercise really interesting. It was a lot of work, but worthwhile. I'll be referencing a few websites and resources, but I won't list the addresses here. I'll put a post on the podcast blog at comicartpodcast.wordpress.com. If you're interested in any of the resources I've mentioned here, then you'll manage with the links better on that site. The first thing to mention is that I'm talking about comic book proposals in this chat. You can submit work to some sites. There are comic book publishers out there that are actively looking for editors, colorists, pencilers, Some are looking all the time. Some, like Oni, open up submissions for certain periods of time. There will be a list of publishers on the blog, and you'll see how many there are. It's a job in itself to keep track of who will be accepting what and when. The other thing to mention is graphic novel proposals. They are slightly different. Usually the requirements of a graphic novel proposal are quite different from a comic book one. There's a brilliant podcast all about graphic novel pitching and production, everything you want to know. It's called Graphic Novel TK. But as I say, the comic book proposal itself, I put forward, it was a fantasy series idea. I looked through the list of publishers. The first thing you have to do is choose the right one. Be aware of what they publish before you submit to them. Obviously, there are some publishers, if you've got a superhero idea, you can see by their output whether that is something they are likely to be interested in or not. Have a look, make sure you're aware of what the publisher wants to publish. Read the requirements thoroughly. A lot of the submission pages tell you that if you don't submit or include things, that they won't look at them. It can sometimes be as simple as an email address or using the right channels and things not to include as well. Do some research. I mean, once I chose Dark Horse and Image, they're the two biggest creator-owned comic publishers. I think they're respectively 3 and 4 in the industry. They are actively looking for submissions of ideas, so that's great. They've got very clear pages on their websites about what their requirements are. So once I decided to give it a go, I read their requirements thoroughly and then went off and tried to do some research. There's lots of blogs, articles and podcasts about people who have followed the process before you. There's a writer called Jim Zub who wrote Skull Kickers. He's done the recent weekly Avengers series. I think he's been doing Iron Man. He's the creator of Invader Zim. He's got an invaluable library of really helpful pages on his website. They were super useful. I think they were some of the ones I used the most. But talking specifically about the proposal that I put together, the first thing after reading both Dark Horse and Image's submission pages, they both required 6 pages of completed art for your story. So that's the biggest and the toughest requirement. You know, they want this as proof of concept, really, they call it. One of the elements that if it's not included won't be reviewed. They want to see what it's going to look like. It has to be consecutive and story pages, so it has to be sequential. And I think also having that there as a requirement shows that you are committed to your idea to actually knuckle down and produce it. Now, with me, I was doing every one of those myself as well, so it was particularly tough when you aren't working as part of a team. But once you've got your pages, there's a slight difference then between the two companies. Dark Horse have got a slightly smaller requirements. That's for a log line. 1 or 2 sentences summing up your idea. The elevator pitch. It's Jaws meet the Powerpuff Girls, is that kind of simple crashing together of 2 ideas. But that can sometimes be a bit too simplistic. So the example they give on their website is, to save the future of mankind, a soldier travels back in time to stop a cyborg from killing the mother of his best friend, the leader of the human resistance. I don't know if that's the best example, but you do get in a bit of a twist putting these together. Again, there's lots of sites that give you a kind of formula that you have to follow. Depending on your idea, what I did was I wrote it as simple as I could, and then I just kept removing and removing and removing. There's lots of help out there where they talk about, you know, always put a descriptor in front of your character and always put it in this order. Next, Dark Horse asked for a synopsis. And this is also an interesting point about a lot of these submissions. They all use similar but slightly different terminology. Image used the word proposal, Dark Horse used the word submission. They both, I think, use the word synopsis, but they mean it in slightly different ways. Dark Horse describe the synopsis as, while the logline is designed to pique the interest of a reader, the synopsis serves to satisfy the reader's curiosity by revealing a bit more about who the characters are and some of the complexities of the plot. But the goal here is still to keep it short, probably no longer than 300 words. Something that Jim Zub definitely really emphasizes in his blogs is to keep all of your pitches short, focused and engaging. He recommends a page or a maximum of 2 pages per pitch. And some of the examples that he gives really boil an idea down, but he does admit himself that he's a professional and the companies know him. So he's already got the experience behind him, so he can kind of do more with less. So the synopsis, straight away, I immediately thought the synopsis was purely just your story boiled down. But as Dark Horse mentioned here, they expected to hear a little more about the characters, some of the complexities. So I saw it in this instance as being, your logline's got to have that immediate impact. So that's what you're first judged on. Are they going to even continue after they've read your logline? These editors are, insanely busy. You are demanding their attention on a busy day. So whatever you give them's got to be interesting. So once you've got through the logline, what can you put in the synopsis that, again, makes them realise that your idea is different, that is compelling, and makes them want to read to the end? After that, Dark Horse asked for a complete outline. Now, this is the entire story. They give you an idea of a short story outline, no longer than a page. An outline for a multi-issue or graphic novel should be no longer than a page per issue. Do not leave the resolution of the story out. Include all spoilers. They don't want to be intrigued at this point. They need to know your full idea. And this is what was happening with Dark Horse. Image, they ask for pretty much the same thing. Again, the terminology is different. They didn't ask for a log line. They asked for a cover letter, which included a brief boiling down of your idea on the first page. They wanted a 1-page synopsis of the overall story arc. So pretty similar to what Dark Horse were calling their full outline. So you can I was using those elements of my pitch. I was writing one pitch document, but having elements of it that I used for different companies. And then they wanted, what was interesting about Image, they then had the further requirements of what makes it different. So the character quirk, settings or the approach. They wanted an intended audience as well, which is quite strange having to think about that. They say everyone is not good enough. So I found a lot of Image comics describe themselves of, if you're a fan of this book, you might like this book. So I chose similar comic books and TV shows of who I thought the intended audience might be interested in. But I tried to name some outside of the genre as well, so that they had the right tone and you weren't choosing things just because of the setting. It was a huge amount of work, but I did think that ultimately forcing yourself to put the requirement certainly of shaping the overall story arc and not just, the kind of first issue or the first story really helped me to expand the ideas that I had to begin with. It started off with a more simplistic, I suppose, goal for the hero. It was a bit more of a revenge, I think, plot when I first started putting it together. But by the end, it became more epic and it had other sort of subplots which really came about from having to write down in a long form exactly what was going to happen. So I did find that putting the pitch together was a really fulfilling exercise in that sense. I'm pleased I did it. obviously, I mean, I've sent it off. It's going to be interesting. They do say they're not going to tell you it's arrived. They're not going to tell you they've read it. So it really is a case of you just have to wait and see if there is any response. Looking back on it now, already, I think it's interesting that I would probably do the next one differently. I have been listening to things and thinking over about the one I've just sent. And I can't help, I keep thinking about Star Wars. I think that the idea I sent was perhaps too big for my first attempt. It was the usual multi-book epic that, you've just been working on for too long in your head, and you've just put the whole idea out there. Whereas thinking about Star Wars, which for me is Star Wars, now it's episode 4, A New Hope, but when Star Wars came out, it was a singular movie. It wasn't part of an expanded universe. It wasn't part of a 9-film trilogy. It was one film that worked incredibly well. He had ideas, Lucas had ideas that were seeded through the film. He obviously perhaps had ideas that he knew where he was going to go afterwards, given it, if it was popular enough. But to be able to pitch a complete story that is able to be expanded upon later, I wished I'd thought of that before I put my pitch in. And it is daft how quickly these things can come to you, but that's why it's a good exercise. So it certainly helped me put the story together. So I'll let you know if anything happens. Thanks for listening. Please let me know if you have any other subjects or areas of comics that you'd like to hear me muse on. But in the meantime, you can find me at This Man This Pete on Instagram and Twitter, or contact me and find links to my comics at thismanthispete.com. Cheers.
Hello everybody, and welcome to Small Press, the Small Press review section of the Comic Art Festival podcast with myself, Tom Stewart from That Comic Smell podcast. How are we all doing this fine day? Now, I'm going to talk about a Small Press book that is predominantly an online Twitter comic. I'll read the premise. A murder, a mysterious coin, a skeletal assassin, and an adventure unlike any other. Who will pay the price? The Price is an experimental comic written one panel a day with nothing planned or pre-written. It is a living story being told as it's created. And it is by David B. Cooper. Now, I stumbled across this a wee while back on his Twitter page, and I just thought it was a really, really good idea. It was just a really solid idea. To do a panel a day, go into it fresh and raw and not really know what he's going to do next. He's just kind of basing it on what's come before and going from there. The first 6 panels or so started off kind of quite lofty with an assassination of a gentleman right off the bat. I don't really want to speak too much on the actual plot line, so I'll just go into how the panels are done on his Twitter page and whatnot as well, because to follow along with the actual story, it is quite intriguing, and I do like the fact that it's quite inventive with that panel a day business. So, and just thinking off the top of your head, and I think it gives the story an extra sort of tilt that you wouldn't normally get. But it's all done in black and white. I actually got this book. Somebody bought it for me from Glasgow Comic Con. And as far as I know, you can't actually get the price anymore on David's website. I don't know if he maybe still does them at the con tables or anything, but the actual comic itself only comprises the first 122 panels. And David himself on his Twitter page has actually reached up to panel 477. So he's well a year into this, and he's done absolutely gangbusters with it. It's great. So it is, as the premise quite says, there is a lot of like death, and there is something with a mysterious coin, and you're following predominantly a couple per se through what's happening with this story, but there's a sort of supernatural element to it. There's an assassin element to it. There's crime. There's loads of stuff going on. There's like a detective story going on amongst it as well. And I think it is because he's sort of coming up with it over the top of his head. It does, like I say, it does give it that slant. It is something a wee bit different. But it's absolutely fantastic. I don't really know a lot of people who do stuff like this. I mean, there is people that do diary comics and stuff like that, but to come up with a narrative and to come up with a story consistently, day after day, for 477 days, he's pretty bang up. That's good effort. That shows commitment to the craft. And, you know, he's no slouch. David will be doing this whilst doing some of his colouring work as well. I mean, David is a comic colourist as well. He's done some pretty notable work. I mean, he's done work on Alex Automatic and The Edge Off with Fraser Campbell and Ian Laurie. He's done colouring work on Pirate Fun. And yeah, David's a really, really good colourist. I mean, I think he's done, if I remember rightly, he's done colouring work on like Batman and stuff as well. But he's got his own output of comics. I mean, he did Bruce, that we spoke about quite recently on That Comic Smell, and he's done one of my favourite comics, Face Down in the Mud. That was about a story about him being mugged and how that had that effect on him. Yeah, I mean, he's got a really solid output, David, but this, to do one panel every day and to give it an actual name and to have a physical copy even with the first 122 panels is fantastic. But we'll get more into the actual price itself. So, like I say from the description, it is a mystery all about a coin and where this coin came from. This professor ends up with this coin, but this coin seems to carry an awful lot of weight with it. It seems to be that if you have this coin, you've got basically like death hanging over you. And in those first 6 panels, like I say, it is the assassination of this professor. And then it's the sort of aftermath from that. And this is where things take a turn. The assassin themselves is a living skeleton in a suit. So there's your first kind of supernatural bit. But we go into bits with the afterlife, and we go into things where there's chases and there's death, there's angels, there's the Grim Reapers, there's everything. It's got a bit of kind of everything. It's got something in it for everyone. So he's covering a lot in sort of genre aspects. David's got a nice sort of accessible style as well. It's not too over stylized. It's nice and cartoony. It really, really works well. And they all kind of tie together within the Twitter page as well, so you can skip back and read them. But they're so easy. I mean, a lot of the panels that he does, there isn't a lot of words on either. I mean, it's a lot of dynamic things because it's a panel a day. So if there's a chase, you'll get somebody running down the hall in one bit, and then it's like 4 or 5 days later and they're still doing that chase scene. So it's nice and easily digested. It's a really, really quick read, even for 477 panels. Now, think of that, it's 477 panels, not pages. So you can get through it kind of relatively quickly. I really massively enjoy it. The only thing that I would say that I wish gets done with it, and I hope it happens once it's finished, because obviously it's asking a lot to do whilst it's going on, but I really hope that he takes his colourist background and adds that to it. I would love to see this thing fully coloured. I think it would just add an extra element that, not that it's lacking right now, it does really well in black and white, but I think it would just add an extra pop to it, definitely. But if you want to have a read of it yourself, and if you want to follow along with the story, and I would highly suggest that you do, because I don't know what kind of imagination he's got, but it's bang on, and he seems to keep it quite consistent and keep the continuity quite well as well. For something that has been going on for so long, going for over a year and doing a panel a day, he seems to do quite well. He must have kind of the cliff notes jotted down somewhere, because he does pretty well with it. You can follow along on his Twitter at David B. Cooper, all one word, no spaces, no underscores, nothing. And you can follow at his website, davidbcooper.com. He also puts the panels up on his Instagram page, David B. Cooper, all smalls, all together, so at David B. Cooper on Instagram as well, and you'll get your panel a day there as well on Instagram. Maybe slightly easier for you, but you'll be able to go through them a bit easier that way. But all 477 panels are up there as well. But yeah, definitely highly recommend it. It's a really good story, a perfect all-rounder, and like I say, you can just take your time going through it, or you can blast through it all in a one-hour. Well worth your time. Well worth a read, definitely. And just before I go today, if you would like to have your small press comic read and reviewed, then please get in touch. You can give me a message on my Twitter at Uramix, URAMYX, or you can reach me on my own podcast Twitter at ThatComicSmell, or you can give me an email at thatcomicsmell@gmail.com if you want to suggest a small press book, or if you want to if you're sending out digital copies or anything, or if you want to just have your book read and reviewed by anybody, then by all means get in touch. Or just point me to some. Folks out there, suggest some small press titles that I could maybe read. I mean, I've got loads of stuff that I could be battering through, but it's always worth getting some new stuff to read and review. Just get in touch. So that, once again, is you can catch me on Twitter at URAMYX, my podcast at ThatComicSmell on Instagram and Twitter, or you can email me at thatcomicsmell@gmail.com. Thanks again, folks, and until next time, enjoy yourself and read loads of comics. I'll see you later.
Thank you for listening. Find out more about the festival at comicartfestival.com. Find out more about the show and how to contact us at comicartpodcast.uk. Find us on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram. Music composed by Pop Noir.